Well, one of the things that you and I have done for years, and I think we kind of touched on this the last time we spoke, is this concept of dichotomies and the game that we play, which is somebody discovering two values or ideas that are separate and distinct from one another, and yet they are, I don't know, it's very difficult for me to be able to wrap my mind around the words to be able to describe this. But the one that's the most obvious to me, or the one that I use the most commonly, is order and chaos. Order being all the things that you know and understand and can navigate, and chaos being everything that you don't. And so all new things come from chaos. It's easy to think of chaos as being all bad or all evil, but it's just that's where the things that you don't understand, and order being the things that are already in your life, and trying to find the balance between those two things. Because if you're always in chaos, you're in total anarchy, and you can't survive there. And too much order being tyranny, too much wrought upon you. But you can extrapolate this game out and play it and find all sorts of other dichotomies, which is kind of a fun way to look at the world.
Yeah, and actually I've been kind of collecting examples of dichotomies, and at first I thought, oh, this is going great. This is really enjoyable. I'm kind of branching out and figuring these things out. But I've come to believe that all the ones that I found are actually just versions of the order and chaos dichotomy. Like literally all of them are just a subspecies of that. A fun one to talk about is infinity and infinitesimal, right? So like if you can picture a one-dimensional, a line, a number line, and you have zero right in the middle. And the further you go away from zero, the closer you get to infinity, right? So infinity is just going out as far away as you can go. And infinitesimal is going as close to zero as you can go without ever actually getting there. So, you can just continually add decimal places, 0.00000, to infinity until you get all the way down to the very last quantity that is not zero, but there's nothing smaller than that. And ultimately, I think of those as there's, how to put this? So basically, the infinitesimal, there is an infinite amount of those all strewn throughout the number line. Like you can't go anywhere without passing an infinite amount of those infinitesimals. But there's only, one or two infinities, depending on how you think about that, right? A positive and negative one.
So why is that then just a derivation of order and chaos? Because to me, it's still a dichotomy. It's an interesting one to say how small can you get versus how, infinitely large. But it doesn't quite map to that's the same as order and chaos.
I would say that the infinity is ultimately... Well, so this is the thing. It's all entirely subjective, right? Like we're just grabbing these things out of the air, and they can mean whatever we want them to mean. In one sense, you could say that the infinitesimal is perfect order because it's like infinitely small, frozen solid, tiny thing that doesn't go anywhere or do anything. And infinity is something you can never actually achieve, right? It's just like striving out into the distance forever. Which seems pretty chaotic to me. Like it's perfect, snug home versus as far as you can go away from home.
Yeah, and like I was trying to think of other dichotomies. It's funny when you get put on the spot like this, it's a little bit like, tell me a joke. And you're like, I don't know how to do that. But we've done this many, many, many times. And in fact, like started cataloging them in your archetypal website.
Well, okay, so let's try another one. So ought versus is, right? We talked about that a little bit, defining those terms last time. And like I want to express again that these are very like poetic concepts, right? It's not meant to say this is the hard truth and you must accept this dichotomy, right? But that ought is order, right? And there's one idea that you have about the way things ought to be. But the way things actually are is almost impossible to ever actually know, right? There's the full detail of the universe is exquisite and infinite, right? So there's this kind of descent into chaos when you zoom into things and zoom in and zoom in and zoom in and zoom in. You just start, going into chaos, and before long you get down to a Planck length or something like this, and we don't even know what happens if there is anything to say about beneath that.
Oh, that's super interesting, because I would have reversed those and said that is the order part of that, because is describes the way something is. But to your point, like, it's very, very difficult to ever nail down a fact that is true no matter what. And that ought is the chaos, because you can pull from any number of ways to look at the world and say, well, it's the way the world ought to be. But this actually brings up one of my favorite conversations that we have ever had, which is about the concept that there's a group out there called the Skeptics. And for people that aren't familiar with this tribe of people, the Skeptics fancy themselves to be people that debunk pseudoscience, or at least that's kind of the more colloquial, new wave skeptics. And they really spend a lot of time going around and saying, well, those people are anti-vaxxers, and let's go find the science that shows that vaccines don't cause autism, and we're just going to hit you with as many papers as we can and show you why that's wrong. But it's not necessarily who the skeptics, of the more ancient definition were. But this kind of is what the definition of it is now. And these people really come along and are pretty harsh about things like they've decided that GMOs are safe. So anybody that doesn't think GMOs are safe, they're idiots, and let's show them why using science. But this led us to a conversation about ought and is regarding the skeptics that really opened my eyes to where their folly really is.
Yeah. I would say that they like many problems that we described, that they smuggle in oughts into what they're just, expounding on, to the detriment of their cause. And ultimately, the one ought that I think that you can permit and still be part of the skeptics is that you ought to know what is, right? So knowing what's going on, or at least trying to some degree as best you can, is kind of the concept of, it seems to me, of what it means to be a skeptic in the modern sense, as you put it, right? Not the philosophic skeptics, but that you ought to know what is. You shouldn't just pass on hearsay and rumors and things like this, that you should want to back your knowledge of the world with some sort of, some sort of evidence or reasoning behind what you believe, rather than just, the ghosts live in the trees and we worship the trees, or something, who knows, whatever kind of thing you want to pick out of the air there.
Well, and that comes from the concept of Hume's guillotine. This is kind of where we came up with this concept from. So Hume's guillotine being, you can't derive an ought from an is, meaning just because you have a scientific fact and you can say, okay, we know that this is true, this causes this, then you shouldn't from that be able to then say, well, then therefore XYZ. And we talked about this before, like, let's imagine that you came to conclusive evidence that climate change is caused by human activity. That is all that you can say. That is what is true, if we imagine that scenario being, verifiable. But just because you say that is true does not mean that then therefore we ought to do X, Y, Z. And Hume's guillotine is trying to cut that off and say, don't try and derive oughts from is. And that gets to the point that you made before, which is a clever turn of phrase, the value smuggling.
Yeah, right. So let's see here. Ultimately Hume's guillotine is, it's just a fact, right? It's saying that these are two different categories and they don't mix. Like, you can know facts about the world, but they don't tell you anything about how the world should be, right? Like, it should be different than it is right now, according to what, right? The only kind of concept that we can get around this is to say that is a subjective preference of an individual, that, I would prefer that, there be more light in here, or there be, beautiful window behind me, or something like that. That's fine. That's a preference that I can hold, but I can't discern that preference based on the facts of the universe, right? Like, what is my purpose for this room? Well, that purpose is an ought. We can kind of, some people would suggest that, that there, in fact, you can, And one term that they use, which I really like the term, and I don't want to throw the whole term in the trash, but that's human flourishing, to say that that is the definition of the way things ought to be to facilitate human flourishing. The problem is that there's not one definition of human flourishing. I think we all have some kind of idea, and they're not, like, I totally accept the point that we're not all going to come up with entirely different concepts. There will be lots of overlap, such as minimizing pain and suffering, and having ease to do the things that we would like to do, and not spend time on drudgery. But
well, human suffering, or the human flourishing, those are the things that pave the way for concepts like the public good, that we should do this for this ideal of human flourishing, and then all these oughts get smuggled into this. And I remember having this revelation when I was in graduate school, and people started talking about, one thing that should be a human right is access to water. And on its face, you're like, okay, that makes total sense. People need water. It should not be made that they can't have this water. But as soon as you start saying that there's a right there, and you use it because we all already agree that human flourishing is what we're all after, or something like that, then you start like having to deal with the reality that water can be a scarce resource, or the ability to move it from one place to another requires work. And as soon as you do that, now you're starting to use force into the world to say the way that things should be that are different than the way that they are. And once you've accepted and you say, well, we already agree that human flourishing is the thing that needs to happen, then we should already agree that water is a human right, and therefore, on
Right.
down the line. And I think that for a very long time in my youth, that part had not been something that I had realized, that in order to be able to change an is to a preference requires like effort, and that effort requires calories to be eaten and fuel to be burned, and all of these things require work that requires somebody to make a preference to add order to that chaos.
Yeah, I mean, in my mind, the formulation of human rights that goes into positive things, and I don't mean like, happy things, but like, you should have access to healthcare, housing, running water, what have you, all of these things. Those are, positive suggestions. They all imply a duty on the rest of humanity to supply that to you, right? And it doesn't ever imply what happens if you don't obtain this for yourself, even though you had the opportunity to. Like, you took your money and you spent it on a fast car instead of having healthcare, right? Like, whatever that is. Like, we don't have any way of of rationalizing this, and ultimately, I think the place that you end up with is that negative formulations of human rights make more sense, like the right to be free from interference, the right to be free from harm, people coming into you and taking over your stuff, right? Like, this is what private property is all about. It draws a line and says, inside of here, you don't have any rights, as opposed to, I'm sitting right here and I have a right that someone will show up and bring this positive thing to me. So it's a lot easier to understand. And I think in terms of like, even zooming out from there, a book that's, I think a lot of folks in the network and listeners here have probably read or heard of is Viktor Frankel's Man's Search for Meaning. And one of my favorite lines in there, I just kind of came across this again, where he points out that asking what is the meaning of life, and by that I think is also an analogy to what is human flourishing, right? It's probably attaining your meaning as close as you can, is like asking what is the best chess move, right? And there's no answer to that question. It's like, well, it depends on what's going on in the game that you're playing right now. Like the best move in game A could be the worst move in game B, and it's totally out of context, and it's not an answerable question generally, right? Just like what is the meaning of life is not an answerable question that someone can just say, oh, the meaning of life is 42, right? Like, that's the classic joke that everybody gives. But it's something that you have to find for yourself. And, Viktor Frankl has got a pretty good lead on, I think, where that goes.
Holy shit. Thanks for checking out this podcast short. If you like this interview, make sure you hit the like and subscribe button and hit that bell so you always get notified about this podcast. And if you're really interested in conversations like this, you may want to consider joining the Articulate Ventures Network. To find out more, go to network.articulate.ventures.